The whaling industry, in Australia anyway, is long gone, although whaling operations on the far south coast of New South Wales used to be one of the biggest industries of the region. It all began in the 1840s when a Cornish seaman and entrepreneur Ben Boyd established a whaling industry in the port of Eden. 20 years later, his company was sold to the Davidson family, who ran it for 3 generations, until the whales stopped coming to Eden in 1929 and the whole industry collapsed. Alice Otton, the great-granddaughter of that first Davidson, still lives in the area, and she has vivid recollections of the days when men in tiny rowing boats hunted the gentle giants of Eden. What makes this story special, though, is the extraordinary relationship formed over almost a century of whaling between the hunters and a pack of killer whales. The killers, as they were collectively known, actually shepherded the whales in to be killed, rounding them up and pushing them towards the men and their harpoons in return for a share of the spoils. Alice Otton is talking with Steve Williamson in Bega.
Well, I have heard that there were 27, but I don't think 27 were regulars. I think that about 12 or 15 may have been, came back year after year, and always got here about a week before the whales started running. So that it's really wonderful, you know. And they sort of lived and played about South Head and a bay just near South Head. And that was where also, not in my time, but in the time of my great-grandfather and grandfather, they always kept a crew and a boat out there at South Head. And the killers knew this, evidently, and they sort of more or less lived around there during the season. And there was a lot of opposition because there were a lot of whales in those times. I've heard my father say that lots of people went in for whaling around about those early times. Also, a very interesting thing he's often told me was that the killers, the helpers, you know, the killer whales they call them now, worked with my people and evidently with Ben Boyd, but they would not work with the opposition people. And I said, why wouldn't they work with other whalers? And the only explanation they had was that our boats were a beautiful deep green colour and the opposition boats were white. Well, now these killers, now we know they're very, very intelligent. And perhaps that must have been the reason. The different colour in the boats. The dark green boats against the white boats.
The killer whales were like shepherds, weren't they? They rounded up the whales.
Yes, they sort of eased the whales into the bay. They evidently knew the boats because they worked with them, and very often one or two swam beside them. And if anybody was tipped overboard, they definitely swam and kept the sharks away. Swam until the person was picked up or got ashore or something. That seems to be a fact. Lots of yarns have been told which are not true, but that's true. And they were wonderful creatures and very, very intelligent. Well, we know now.
Did the whales, the killer whales, did they benefit from this relationship with the men in any way?
Well, they were always sure of a meal. If they helped the whalers kill a whale, they were sure of a meal because they always got the tongue. And that was they relished that. And always sure of a good feed, you see. Perhaps they may not have been able to kill the whale if they hadn't had help. Probably they would have, sometimes, but not always. So that they benefited in that way, that they always had the best part of the whale, that they considered the best part anyway. They had them named, those with any distinctive feature, like a broken fin or something like that. Well, I don't know why Cooper was called Cooper, but there was one called Cooper. There was Jackson, there was Tom, and Hooky, he had a hooked fin, and Humpy, Typee, Albert, Stranger, Kincher, Old Ben and Young Ben. They're the names I have, and I know I've heard of, you know. So that, they regarded them as friends and allies and helpers, and had no fear whatever of them. In fact, just the opposite. I think the killer whales are one of the most interesting things I've ever heard of.
These days, people must find this story you're telling us now most extraordinary. But I suppose in those days it was all very much taken for granted.
Oh, quite, yes. As a child, I never questioned it, I remember. Never questioned the killers. They were the killers and that was it. And they were our friends and helpers, and never dreamt of being in fear of them. No, it was an extraordinary thing, but the whole district took them for granted, never questioned that the killers helped kill the whales, and then helped to eat it, or ate it, or what they could, and then left it alone. And that was the end of it.
And never did any further damage to the carcass or even threaten the lives of those men in boats?
Oh, no, just the opposite. As I say, they've been known to swim beside a man who's been tipped overboard. And some very often a couple of them swim with the boat. And definitely keep the sharks off. If there was any sign of shark, keep the sharks off if there was a smash, which there was fairly frequently, because whales are pretty strong things. And the boat would be smashed and they'd all be tipped out, but no fear at all if during a chase because of the killers. They were there to guard them and help them if necessary, so that there was no fear. They were treated as friends and helpers.
Some people might say they were hard men to kill whales. What were they like?
Oh, I think they were fairly hard men, but you see, it was a living. And in those days, people didn't consider the feelings of animals like they do now. I remember I was about 15 before I realised it was terrible murder, because I was in the bay in a small boat, and there was a whale chase up the bay. And it was a beautiful winter's morning, and I heard that whale sort of groan or make a terribly tragic sound, and I realised then how terrible it was, being shot with this harpoon, not shot, but a harpoon thrown into it first, and then a lance being used on it, and every opportunity. Just murdering it like that must have been dreadful. And the killers harassing it and pulling at its lips and its fins and biting it. What a terrible thing. Now I know, now I realise how terrible it was. But in those days it was a living.
What was the average workaday like for the whalers? When did the season begin, for instance?
Well, in the beginning of winter, that's all I can tell you. I wouldn't know the dates or anything like that, but the beginning of winter, well, the killers would come home, and that was what I've often heard somebody say, the killers are home, the killers are home. And that meant that the killers had been sighted somewhere in the bay. Well, in about a week or so after that, the whales would start to come north, and they'd come into the bay to calve. And then the poor things would be chased and killed. And that was the beginning of the season. And, well, in a way, it was a leisurely life, because there were days and days that go by when no whales would be sighted. But then when a whale was sighted, then it was hard, because out they went straight away and stayed out.
Follow it in a boat and wait for it to surface, would they, and then spear it?
Oh, yes, well, they surface fairly frequently, to get air, and they'd spout. And then they'd know where they were by the spout. And yes, they'd follow it, with the killers, of course, edging it on all the time. They'd follow it until they got close enough to harpoon it, and the harpoon was attached to a rope, and the rope was attached to the boat, and then off the whale would go, dragging the boat, and then they'd somehow or another get close enough to lance it with a lance. And that's when the murder started, lancing it, you see. And if they got it in the right spot the first time, but it must have been pretty tricky getting up close enough to a whale who was half mad with pain and lance it out of a boat, and especially if the sea was a bit rough, which it often was. But that's how it was done. Then the whale would be thrashing about and thrashing about, and finally die, and then be dragged down by the killers.
So they'd remain there with the whale, would they?
No, they wouldn't remain with the whale. They'd come home and rest, and then within 24 hours go back out and bring it into the try works. Get started on taking the blubber off the carcass, and that was done with boat spades. A couple of men standing around on the top of the whale, getting the blubber off, and then it was hauled up skids and cut into great lumps and put into these iron pots and boiled. And then the oil was put into the casks or kegs. They weren't very big kegs. And then finally taken across to Eden to be put on the coastal ship and taken to Sydney.
What type of whales were they exactly, the ones that were caught?
Finbacks and black whales, and they were the most valuable because the bone and the fin in the black whale was used, but not the bone in any of the others, but the bone of the black whale. Finbacks and black whales, and I think they call them blue whales. I think they're finbacks. They were the type that came here.
I suppose really it was a time for celebration once a whale had been sighted, because upon this many people's livelihoods depended. When it was all over, what did the people do when they got out of their boats after a very exhausting row, sometimes lasting a day and a night on the bay? What did those men do once they finally got back onto dry land?
I guess they went straight for the bath and food and rest. They talked a lot about it, and what the killers did, and what Jackson did, and what Cooper did, and somebody else did something else, and how vicious the whale was, or if it wasn't vicious, and if it had a calf, which they often had.
Imagine the women folk back on shore were very relieved to see them back.
Oh, yes, I think that's a fact. But of course the main whaling had stopped before I was born. The days when they kept a lookout at South Head and that kind of thing, they were gone before I was born. I think it must have started to deteriorate from that time, and then of course it fizzled right out about anything from 1915 to 1929. No more whales. So that it's a queer thing. It was suggested to me that being very, only the other day, intelligent animals, they must have known what was happening and sort of decided they wouldn't come up this way anymore. But anyway, they didn't, for some reason, unless they were killed out, because whaling was intense everywhere in the world at that time. So lots of them could have been killed, couldn't they? It could have been scarce. But it was a wonderful life while it lasted. Well, it was for we children anyway, because we always, as I say, had horses, and we used to do a lot of riding, and we had the beaches and we had boats, and we didn't have any picture shows or anything like that, and we didn't miss them because we didn't know about them. And we just lived a wonderful life.
Alice Otton, with memories of that remarkable symbiosis between man and mammal, the killer whales of Eden.